I have here two bits of wood that I've had made for me. This one is destined to be the handle of a poleaxe, and this one, much longer and thinner, will become a spear shaft. But before I attached the ironmongery to turn them into those weapons, I thought I'd use them for a while to illustrate quarterstaffs, or perhaps I should say quarterstaves. Now, some people will say that these weapons are actually called quarterstaves and not quarterstaffs, and some people will say that no, it's one quarterstaff, but two, plural, quarterstaves. Thank goodness such sort of drivel doesn't matter in videos like this. You know what I'm talking about? Big sticks that you hit people with. Right, so quarterstaffs, because that's the word I'm used to. They are associated with the English. Oh, England, merry England, the stout yeomen of England, from about 1500 to the end of the 19th century. The English took great pride in their skill with the quarterstaff, and they trained in it, wrote things about it, and had competitions in it, and generally very proud of themselves. And there are heartwarming stories to warm the cockles of any Englishman's heart of men armed with these, beating up loads of Spaniards armed with rapiers and stuff. But before we get too carried away with the Englishness of the quarterstaff, can we just remind ourselves that we're talking about a big stick? And I don't think the English can really claim to have invented the big stick, nor be the first people in the world, or the only people in the world, ever to think to themselves, hey, do you know, you could hit people with these. Now, a style of kung fu that I studied for some years was Wing Chun, and that had a pole form. Granted, it's not a very ancient pole form, but I think we should just remind ourselves it's a big stick. Now, just how big a stick is it? And is there anything else we should know about it? What's it made out of? Well, this one's made out of ash, and ash is definitely one of the woods that was used. You want something pretty solid, pretty hard, and got a substantial bit of weight to it, because you're going to hit people with it. You're going to swing as well as thrust, and so you want something that's fairly substantial and fairly stiff. Now, I've seen in many fictional representations of quarterstaffs and some historical attempts at reconstruction, someone is pictured holding something that's got bark on it and little nodules all down it where twigs have been cut away. It looks like a coppiced pole, or perhaps a sapling. And yes, you could make a quarterstaff just by cutting a sapling or coppiced pole to length and trimming off the twigs, but it wouldn't be very good. Better than nothing, but not anything like as good as something taken from a solid tree trunk. Couple of reasons. One is that you want the outside to be smooth. You want to be able to change grip, slide your hand round as you fight, and that's difficult if it's rough and knobbly. Another thing is that a coppiced pole is young wood. It's largely sapwood, which is soft and springy, and that's not what you want a quarterstaff to be. You want it to be hard and stiff. You want that movement to be accompanied by a sort of thwack and crunch sound as your opponent's skull crushes, rather than a sort of a boing and laughter noise. So the fact that these are made out of tree trunks is a possible reason for why they are called quarterstaves, which they could then become quarterstaffs, in the first place. Because if you want to make a bit of doweling from a tree, you don't actually use the center of the tree where the rings are concentric. You don't use that middle bit of the tree, because then when it seasons, when it dries out, it'll warp and crack. Instead, typically what you do is you cut the tree trunk in half, because that's the easiest single big split to make, and then half again. Again, it's the next easiest big split to make, and then each quarter of the tree trunk can be turned into one quarterstaff, and then when it seasons, it shouldn't crack and it'll not warp very much. So that's one reason that they may be called quarterstaffs. It's a quarter of a tree trunk, or made from, and the rest wouldn't be wasted, because ash is excellent firewood. So that's quite a feasible way that they were made. Another reason that they might be called quarterstaffs or quarterstaves is the way you hold them. So for instance, one way of holding them is you put one hand smack in the middle and the other one at about a quarter of the way up. So you've got a quarter of the length, a quarter of the length, and then a half. Quarterstaff. The trouble is, that's not the only way to hold one. You can also hold one either side of the quarter mark there, or with one hand on the end and the other one about a quarter of the way up the length. So that's three variations of a hold that might explain quarterstaff. But there are plenty of other ways of holding a quarterstaff as well. For instance, at the 1/3 and 2/3 mark. So if there are loads of ways of holding the thing and everyone's calling it a quarterstaff, I suspect that's not the reason. If we do know the reason, and we don't for sure, I think it's probably the "it's a quarter of a tree" reason. Right. So how thick are they? Well, I would say you want it to be a little bit thicker than the spear shaft. Now, this spear shaft is 1.25 inches in diameter, which is quite typical for a spear shaft. And I would say that's a little bit thin for a quarterstaff. I'd want to be able to whack someone with a little bit more weight. This, on the other hand, which is about 1.75 inches, is overkill. This is too heavy and slow. So somewhere in the region of 1.5 inches in diameter seems to be about right. However, some illustrations of quarterstaffs show them as surprisingly thin from the period. Paulus Hector Meyer's quarterstaffs are really quite small sticks. They look like broom handles. They're quite short too, quite clearly a lot shorter than the user. And yet there are plenty of sources that will tell you that a quarterstaff should be 6 feet long, or the height of the user. But there are plenty of others that will say, oh no, they should be much longer than that. 8 feet, 9 feet long is a proper quarterstaff length. Well, if something varies that much in length, from really quite a lot bit shorter than the user to a lot taller than the user, then presumably the technique with which it was used would vary as well. And once a weapon is so different in size that it's used radically differently, you could say it's actually a different weapon rather than just a different size of the same weapon. Anyway, perhaps Hector Meyer's stuff is not really quarterstaff. It's some sort of foreign thing, not like a proper English yeoman's quarterstaff. They seem to have been the weapon of preference for the travelling man. You've got a big stick with you, and with this you can see off brigands. Were they ever used in battle? I've heard people talk about the battlefield version, but I know of no evidence that they were actually used as or regarded as a viable battlefield weapon. If you're going to go into battle, you may as well have something that's quite specialist as a weapon, with a load of ironmongery on one end and axe heads and spiky bits and so forth, rather than just a stick. I've also read many times, and even seen illustrated, quarterstaffs that are iron shod at either end with a sort of tube of iron. That's perfectly feasible. Yes, if the quarterstaff is your preferred weapon, then why not clad the end in iron to give it a bit more punch? But I've never seen an example from the period. I don't know if any survive, and I don't know of any evidence to back that up. It seems feasible, but it might not actually have been true. So how long were they? Well, as I say, it depends on how you use them. Now, the Victorians were quite keen on competitions, and they tended to use the sort of kayak paddle technique, and theirs seemed to have been a little bit shorter, around sort of 6 foot. When I did reenactment, we trained with quarterstaffs, and we found that about a foot taller than the user, or about 7 foot, somewhere around there, was ideal. It was partly to do with the technique we were using, however. So how long it should be, I would say, varies with what technique you plan to use it with. I'll be making another video about technique. And now I'm beginning to run out of things. Yes, another thing I can say, that it was actually part of standard, would you believe, Boy Scout training until the early 20th century. Scouts were scouts in those days. They learned how to thwack each other with sticks, and they got to carry proper knives, and they did responsible things, and all that's been lost. But anyway, the quarterstaff. Yes, it's sort of an English weapon, but let's not get too carried away by the Englishness of it. It seems to have reached its peak at a time when in battle gunpowder was being used as the main battle-winning thing. Guys were wandering into battle with muskets, and if you've got a really big heavy musket, perhaps with a musket stand put it on, you've got a couple of things right there to hit someone with, so you're very unlikely to carry a quarterstaff as well. But if you're just journeying on your own down the road and you get beset by brigands, in skilled hands a really big stick is pretty difficult to beat. Lindybeige!